Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story.
My wife died on a Sunday afternoon, alone, at the bottom of our own staircase. The police called it an accident. I believed them too, for exactly 2 days. Then I found her handwriting in a place it should never have been, inside a bank document dated 1 week before she died, warning me about a man she had never even met. 42 years of marriage, and I was about to learn the truth. But tell me, if the person you loved most in this world tried to warn you from beyond the grave, would you even recognize the signs in time? The funeral was held on a Thursday morning at Mount Olive Baptist Church on the east side of Detroit. I stood at the front pew in a black suit I had not worn since our anniversary dinner 3 years back. Reverend Otis Mayfield read from the Book of Psalms, the same passage Josephine had circled in her own Bible years ago. I did not cry during the service. I had already cried everything out in the 2 days before it. My daughter Renee sat beside me, her hands folded tight in her lap, her eyes fixed on the casket instead of on me. She had not looked me in the eye since the morning she called to tell me the ambulance was on its way. Beside her sat Dante Cole, the man she had been seeing for 8 months, dressed in a gray suit too expensive for a man who claimed to be between real estate deals. When the service ended, people lined up outside to shake my hand. Neighbors I had known 30 years, men I had fixed engines for without ever charging a dime, because that is what you do for your own people. Dante was near the end of that line. He gripped my hand too hard, held it a second too long, and said, "Sorry for your loss, old man. You holding up okay out here?" Nobody had called me old man to my face in 70 years of living. I let it go and moved on to the next person waiting. Renee hugged me next. It was quick and stiff, the kind of hug you give a stranger at a bus station, not the kind you give your own father on the worst day of his life. She said she loved me, said Mama was in a better place now. Then her phone buzzed in her purse, and she stepped away to answer it before I could say anything back. I watched her walk toward the parking lot, phone pressed against her ear, back turned to the doors where her mother's casket was still being carried out. I did not know who was calling her at a moment like that, and I did not ask. Cornell Briggs found me near the church steps. He had been chief of police in our precinct for 11 years, and Josephine and I had known him since our girls played on the same Little League softball team years back. He shook my hand, held my shoulder firm, and said, "Leon, I am so sorry. Josephine was one of the good ones." Then he looked past me toward Dante, who was laughing loudly at something on his phone near the entrance, and Cornell's face tightened for a second before he smoothed it back over. "You need anything, you call me," Cornell said, patting the pocket where I kept my phone. "Anything at all, day or night." I told him I would. I did not think much of it at the time. The repast was held in the church fellowship hall. Long tables covered in white cloth, plates piled high with fried chicken and collard greens and macaroni and cheese. Every dish brought by some woman who had loved Josephine over the years. I sat at the head table and let people come to me instead of walking around myself. My knees were not what they used to be. Dante sat across from me at one point, working through a plate Renee had fixed for him. He asked how business at the shop was doing. I told him it was slow, same as every December for 38 years running. He nodded and said a man my age should not have to stand on his feet all day, that there were smarter ways to make money off a property like mine. I told him the shop was not just property, it was 38 years of my life. He smiled and said he understood, then went back to his plate. Renee did not sit with me at all during that repast. She moved from table to table, instead thanking people, hugging people, laughing at something one of Josephine's old church friends said near the dessert table. By the time the hall emptied out, it was almost 4 in the afternoon. I helped stack the folding chairs against the wall out of old habit.
Renee offered to drive me home in Dante's car, but I told her I needed the walk to clear my head. It was only 6 blocks. She did not argue. I walked out alone past the parking lot where Dante's car sat gleaming under the pale sun and turned onto the sidewalk, heading toward home. My phone buzzed hard inside my coat pocket before I had gone half a block. I pulled it out slowly. The screen showed a number I did not recognize, a local area code, no name attached to it anywhere. I stood there on that cold sidewalk for a long moment, staring down at the screen, my thumb hovering just above the answer button. Not sure yet if I wanted to know who was calling me. I let the call go. Whoever it was could try again if it mattered enough. I put the phone back in my coat pocket and kept walking the last 5 blocks toward home, my breath fogging up in front of my face with every step. Our house sat on the corner of Linwood and Finkel, the same house Josephine and I bought back in 1984 when Renee was still in diapers. I could see the porch light on from half a block away, which struck me as strange since nobody should have gotten there before me. When I reached the driveway, I heard the garage door standing open, the metal frame creaking slightly in the wind. Dante was inside, crouched down near the back wall with a yellow tape measure stretched from one side of the garage to the other. He had a small notebook tucked under his arm and a pen behind his ear, the kind of pen a man keeps for writing down numbers he wants to remember later. I stood in the driveway and watched him for a moment before he noticed me. He was measuring the width of the garage floor, then the height of the ceiling. Then he stepped outside and looked up at the roof line, nodding to himself like he was pricing something out in his head. "Dante," I said. He turned around fast, and for half a second his face did something I had not seen from him before. A flash of surprise that looked almost like guilt before he caught it and smoothed it back into that easy smile of his. "Mr. Ashworth," he said. "Didn't hear you walk up. I was just, checking a few things out here for Renee." "Checking what exactly?" I asked him. He held up the tape measure like it explained everything. Renee wanted to know the square footage on the property for the paperwork. Insurance stuff, mostly. You know how it is, after somebody passes, there's always forms to fill out, numbers they need. I looked at the notebook tucked under his arm and asked him what exactly he was writing down in there. He tapped the notebook against his palm. "Numbers help me keep things straight," he said. "Square footage, ceiling height, that sort of thing. Insurance companies ask for all of it these days before they'll even process a claim on a property this size." I did not know how it was not exactly, since Josephine had always handled anything with paperwork in our house for the last 20 years. But I nodded anyway and told him that was fine, and walked past him into the house through the side door. Renee was in the kitchen when I came in, still wearing her black dress from the funeral, standing at the counter going through a stack of mail that had piled up on the table over the past few days. She looked up when the door opened and gave me a tired smile. "Hey, Daddy," she said. "You walked the whole way." I told her I did, that it cleared my head some. Then I asked her about Dante, out there in the garage with a tape measure. She set the mail down and rubbed her eyes. "Daddy, don't make this into something it isn't. I asked him to get some measurements for me. The insurance company wants square footage on file, now that Mama's well, now that things are changing around here. It's just paperwork. He's trying to help." "Help with what, exactly?" I asked her again. On the table behind her sat a small stack of envelopes she had already sorted, and I could see the top one had the seal of our credit union stamped in the corner. I asked her if that one needed my signature on anything. She slid it under the rest of the pile without quite looking at me and said it was nothing urgent, just routine statements. "With everything, Daddy," she said, her voice sharper now than it had been a second ago. "With the house, with the shop, with all of it, somebody has to think about these things. You can't run that shop forever, and this house is too big for one person." I did not say anything back to that. I walked over to the refrigerator and poured myself a glass of water. I did not particularly want, just to have something to do with my hands. Renee kept talking while my back was turned. "Dante's got a good head for this stuff, Daddy. He's helped people my age figure out their whole financial futures. I think it would be good for you to sit down with him sometime soon. Let him walk you through some options." "Options for what?" I asked, turning back around to face her. She hesitated for just a second, long enough for me to notice it. "Just options," she said, "for your future. That's all I'm saying right now." I finished the glass of water and set it in the sink. Through the kitchen window, I could see Dante still out in the garage, now taking a picture of the ceiling with his phone. Dante came in through the side door a minute later, brushing dust off his hands, and set his notebook down on the counter long enough to grab a bottle of water from the refrigerator. He told Renee he had everything he needed out there and would send the numbers over to his contact by morning. Renee thanked him and touched his arm. Neither of them looked over at me while they talked. My own phone buzzed again in my coat pocket, the same unfamiliar number lighting up the screen for the second time that evening. Renee looked at me. "You gonna answer that?" I looked down at the screen, then back up at my daughter standing in her mother's kitchen, with her mother not even 3 days in the ground. "I think I will, this time," I said. I stepped out onto the back porch before I answered, away from the kitchen window where Renee could see my face. The cold hit me through my suit jacket, but I did not go back inside for a coat. I pressed the phone to my ear and said hello, my breath coming out in a thin white cloud in front of me. "Leon, it's Cornell. Sorry to call so late, and sorry for calling twice without saying who it was. I didn't want to leave my name on a voicemail. Not for this." I asked him why not and what this was that he was talking about, keeping my voice down low, even though nobody was close enough to hear me out there in the cold. He was quiet for a second before he answered, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "I need you to listen close, and I need you to not say anything to anybody about this conversation. Not Renee, not that young man she's been keeping company with. You understand me?" I told him I understood, though I did not yet, not really. Cornell said he still had a few contacts left over from his years on the force, people who owed him favors, people who worked over at the county recorder's office, and at 2 of the credit unions downtown. He said one of those contacts had called him that morning out of pure courtesy, because Cornell's name was still listed as an emergency contact on an old account of mine from years back. One I had forgotten even existed until he said it. "There's a lien filing that went through on your property 3 weeks ago," Cornell said. "A home equity line of credit, $42,000, secured against the house on Linwood. Your signature is on it, Leon." I told him that was not possible, that I had not signed anything like that, not in months, maybe longer than that even. "That's what I figured," Cornell said, "because the signature don't match anything they got on file from you before. It's close, real close, but it ain't right. Whoever signed that document practiced your name a whole lot of times, but they missed the way you loop your capital L, the little tail you always add at the end of it." I stood there on the porch steps with the phone pressed hard against my ear, not saying anything for a long moment, watching my own breath fog up in front of me in the cold night air. "There's more," Cornell said, and his voice dropped lower, like he was choosing each word carefully before he let it out into the open. "Leon, I've been turning something over in my head since the day Josephine passed, and I didn't want to say it at the funeral, not with everybody standing around listening. But I don't believe a woman as careful as she was just loses her footing on a staircase she walked up and down every single day for 30 straight years." I asked him what he meant by that, my voice coming out rougher than I wanted it to sound. "I think somebody ought to look a little closer at how she fell," he said. I think you ought to be careful about who you trust in that house right now. And I think you shouldn't sign one single piece of paper that gets put in front of you, not until we know more about what's really going on around you." Through the kitchen window behind me, I could see Renee moving back and forth, wiping down the counter, putting away the last of the mail from the table. Dante was gone by then, his car no longer sitting in the driveway, where it had been an hour earlier. "Cornell," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "you're telling me somebody forged my name on a loan against my own house, and you're telling me you don't trust how my wife died? Those are 2 mighty different things you're laying on me at the same time, Cornell." "They might not be as different as you think," Cornell said. "That's exactly why I'm calling you tonight, instead of waiting until morning." I asked him what he thought I should do about any of it. "For now, nothing," he said. "Don't confront anybody. Don't let on that you know a thing about any of this. You go on inside that house tonight and you act like a tired old man who just buried his wife. Because right now, that's the safest thing you can be around them. But you start paying attention to every little thing, every piece of paper, every phone call, every visitor who comes through that door. And you call me the second something don't sit right with you,
no matter what time it is. I told him I would, and I meant every word of it. Before he hung up, Cornell said one more thing that stopped me cold. He said Josephine had come to see him alone about 6 weeks before she died, asking questions about how a person would go about proving fraud against a family member in a court of law. He said he had not thought much of it at the time, figured she was helping some lady from church with a problem, the way she always did for everybody around her. He said he wished now he had asked her more questions, instead of letting her walk out of his office that day. I stood on that porch a long while after the call ended, the cold finally working its way all through my bones. My mind went back to something Josephine used to say, every time she hid Christmas presents or birthday money from me, back before the grandkids ever came along. Back when it was still just the two of us, figuring out this life together, one paycheck at a time. She always kept her secrets in the same place. The old sewing box in the bedroom closet. The one with the broken latch she never let me fix, because she said a man had no business knowing where a woman kept her private things. I went back inside the house and told Renee I was tired and heading up to bed early. She barely looked up from the counter to say goodnight to me. I waited until I heard the shower running in Renee's old room down the hall, the one she still used whenever she stayed over most nights that week. I did not turn on the overhead light in our bedroom. I used the small lamp on Josephine's side of the bed instead, the one with the yellow shade she always said made the room feel like morning, even at midnight. The closet door stuck the way it always had, the same swollen wood that never quite fit right, no matter how many times I planed it down over the years. I pulled it open, slow, and reached past her winter coats, past the shoe boxes stacked along the floor, until my hand found the corner of the sewing box, tucked behind everything else. It was heavier than I remembered. I carried it over to the bed and set it down on Josephine's side, right where she used to sit every evening, with her needle and thread mending whatever needed mending that week. The broken latch gave way easy under my thumb, same as it always did. On top sat her usual things: spools of thread in every color, a pincushion shaped like a tomato, a pair of scissors with the orange handles she had owned longer than we had been married. I moved all of it aside, carefully laying each piece on the quilt beside me, until my fingers found the false bottom she had built into that box years ago, out of a cigar box lid and some careful measuring. I lifted the false bottom out. Underneath it sat a single brown envelope, folded once down the middle, my name written across the front in her handwriting. Not Leon. She had written Leon Jr. Ashworth, the full name only she ever used, the one from my birth certificate, that even my own mother had stopped calling me by the time I was 10 years old. My hands were not steady when I opened it. Inside was a bank statement, 3 pages stapled together, from an account I recognized as my retirement fund through the credit union. The one Josephine and I had built together over 30 years, of putting a little aside from every paycheck we ever earned between us. The balance on the front page read $11,000. The balance should have read closer to $90,000. I flipped through the pages slow, my eyes catching on withdrawal after withdrawal, going back nearly 8 months. Each one a few $1,000s at a time, spaced out careful enough that no single withdrawal looked alarming on its own. Every one of them carried a signature at the bottom of the authorization slip. My signature, or something close enough to pass for it at a glance. Behind the bank statement sat a single sheet of notebook paper, folded into quarters, covered edge to edge in Josephine's handwriting. The same careful cursive she used to write out spelling words for her 3rd graders every Friday afternoon for 25 years. Leon, if you are reading this, then something has happened to me. Before I could tell you myself, and I am sorry for that, more than I can say. I found the withdrawals in March, going through the mail before you got home from the shop. I did not want to scare you until I knew for certain who was behind it. I kept reading. She wrote that she had gone to the credit union herself in April, asking questions under the excuse of updating our account information, and that a young teller had let slip the name attached to a secondary authorization on the account. A name added back in the fall, without either of our knowledge. The name was not Dante Cole. It was a name I had never heard before in my life. Marcus Delray Whitfield. I sat there on the edge of the bed, holding that piece of paper for a long time, reading the name over and over, trying to place it somewhere in my memory, and coming up with nothing at all. The letter went on. Josephine wrote that she believed this Marcus Whitfield and the man Renee was seeing were connected somehow, though she had not yet found proof solid enough to bring to me or to anyone else. She wrote that she was scared, not for herself, but for what it might mean for Renee if her suspicions turned out to be true. The last line of the letter was underlined twice, the pen pressed hard enough into the paper that I could feel the groove of it under my thumb. Do not trust anyone with this until you know the whole truth. Not even our daughter. I heard the shower shut off down the hall. I folded the letter back along its original creases and slid it into my coat pocket, along with the bank statement, then packed the sewing box back together exactly the way I had found it, thread by thread, until it looked untouched. I sat in the dark for a while after that, the lamp switched off, listening to Renee's footsteps cross the hallway toward her old room. Marcus Delray Whitfield. I said the name out loud once, quiet, just to hear how it sounded in my own voice. It did not sound like anybody I knew. But somewhere out there it belonged to somebody who knew exactly who I was. Renee cooked dinner that Friday night, the first real meal anybody had made in that kitchen since before the funeral. She fried pork chops the way Josephine used to, though hers came out a shade darker than her mother's ever did. And she made a pot of greens that needed more vinegar than she put in. I did not say anything about either one. I sat at the head of the table, where I always sat, and waited for Dante to take his usual seat across from me. Halfway through the meal, I let my fork slip out of my hand and clatter against the plate, louder than it needed to. Renee looked up first. "You all right, Daddy?" I told her my hands had been shaking some lately, ever since the funeral, and that I was sorry for the noise. She reached over and patted my arm, told me it was understandable that grief did things to a body nobody could explain. Dante nodded along with her cutting into his pork chop, without much concern on his face at all. I asked Renee twice, within 10 minutes, what day it was the second time, barely 3 sentences after she had already answered me the first time. She answered again, patient, a little sad around the eyes, the way a daughter looks at a father she has already started grieving, even though he is sitting right there in front of her, still breathing, still at her table. Dante set his fork down at one point and looked at me, careful studying my face the way a man studies an engine he is trying to figure out whether it still runs. "You doing okay these days, Mr. Ashworth? Sleeping all right at night?" I told him sleep did not come easy in that house anymore, not with her side of the bed empty every night. I laid down in it. I let my voice crack a little on the word empty, more than it actually wanted to crack on its own. He nodded, slow, satisfied by whatever he saw on my face, and went back to his plate without another word about it. Renee reached over and squeezed my hand across the table, told me she was there for me, that I did not have to carry any of this alone. I asked her, careful, if she remembered where her mother kept the good silverware, the set we only brought out for holidays. It was a foolish question, one Josephine would have laughed at me for asking, since that silverware had sat in the same drawer for 30 years. Renee answered patiently anyway, walking me through it slow like I might not remember come morning. After dinner, Renee cleared the plates while Dante stepped out onto the back porch to take a phone call he said was work-related. I stayed at the table a moment longer, my eyes drifting to the small wooden box sitting on the sideboard against the far wall. The one that used to hold Josephine's good jewelry, the pieces she only wore to church on special Sundays and to weddings. I got up slow, using the table for support, the way a man with bad knees actually would, and made my way over to the sideboard while Renee ran water in the sink with her back turned to me. I lifted the lid of the jewelry box, quiet as I could manage, the small hinge creaking just once. Inside sat her wedding ring, which I had already moved to my own dresser the week before, tucked safe where nobody would think to look for it. Beside the empty space where the ring used to sit was a small silver pendant on a thin chain, shaped like an oval locket, the one Josephine had worn nearly every day for the last 3 years, since her granddaughter from her sister's side had given it to her as a gift.
She always told people it was just a keepsake,
something to hold a photograph of the grandbabies inside.
I knew better than that. Josephine had shown me once, late one night when she thought I was already asleep beside her, how the back of that pendant twisted open to reveal a tiny recording device, tucked inside, no bigger than a shirt button. She used it, she told me, to record herself reading recipes out loud when her hands were too busy with flour and butter to write anything down. So she could play the recordings back later and copy them onto paper for the young mothers at church who kept asking for her cooking secrets. I closed my hand around the pendant and slipped it into my shirt pocket before Renee could turn around from the sink to see what I was doing over there. "Daddy, what are you doing over there?" she asked, drying a plate with a dish towel, still not looking at me directly, her voice light and easy. "Just looking at your mother's things," I said, "in case I want something small to remember her by, something I can carry close." She told me to take whatever I wanted, that none of it mattered much next to actually missing her every single day. I told her she was right about that, and I meant it, even with everything else weighing so heavy on my mind that night. Dante came back inside a few minutes later, tucking his phone into his back pocket, telling us both that work never seemed to slow down these days, not even on a Friday evening like this one. Renee asked if everything was all right with the call he had just taken outside. He said it was fine, just a client asking about paperwork on a property closing somewhere across town. I sat back down at the table and let my hand rest over my shirt pocket for a moment, feeling the small weight of that pendant resting there against my chest, cool through the fabric of my shirt. Later that night, alone in the bathroom, with the door locked behind me, I turned the pendant over slow in the light above the mirror and found the tiny seam Josephine had shown me years before, running along the edge of the oval shell. I twisted it open, carefully, my thumb brushing against a small button on the side I did not remember her ever mentioning to me. A faint green light blinked once beneath the button, small as a firefly caught in a jar, and went dark again just as quick. I stood there a long moment, staring down at that little piece of silver in my palm, turning it over once more under the bathroom light. There was still power left inside it. Whatever she had recorded onto that little device before she died, it was still sitting in there, waiting on me to find it, waiting on me to finally listen. Cornell still kept a small office above a barber shop on Fenkell, 3 blocks from the shop I had run for 38 years. A space he rented out cheap from a man who used to be his partner on the force. He did private consulting work now for a handful of lawyers and insurance companies. The kind of work that let a retired chief keep his hands busy without putting a badge back on. I walked in on a Tuesday morning with a brown envelope tucked inside my coat, the same one Josephine had hidden in her sewing box. Cornell locked the door behind me before I even sat down, pulled the blinds shut over the window that faced the street, and told me to lay everything out on the desk in front of him. I handed him the bank statement first, then the letter in Josephine's handwriting, watching his face while he read through both of them, slow and careful, his lips moving slightly, the way they always did when he concentrated hard on something. He set the papers down when he finished and looked up at me. "Marcus Delray Whitfield," he said, saying the name out loud the same way I had said it alone in my bedroom a few nights before. "You ever heard that name before in your life, Leon?" I told him I had not. Not once, not from Josephine, not from Renee, not from anybody at church or at the shop. Cornell turned to his computer, an old desktop that took its time waking up, and typed the name into a database he still had access to from his years running background checks for the department. He waited, tapping a pen against the desk while the machine worked through whatever it needed to work through. "First thing that comes up is a Michigan license from about 6 years back," he said, squinting at the screen. "Different address than anything current out on the west side near Dearborn. Expired now." He kept scrolling, quiet for a stretch, and then he sat back in his chair, slow, the way a man sits back when he has found something he was not fully expecting to find so easy. "Leon," he said, "this same face, same date of birth, comes up under 2 other names in 2 other states. Marcus Whitfield in Michigan, Damon Reese in Ohio, about 4 years back. And before that, going back almost 7 years now, a name out of Georgia, Terrence Boykin." I asked him how he could be sure it was the same man behind all 3 names. He turned the monitor around so I could see it myself. 3 photographs, 3 different names attached, 3 different birth dates that did not quite match up with each other, but the face in every one of them was the same face. Younger in the Georgia photo, a little heavier in the Ohio one, but the same eyes, the same shape to the jaw, the same small scar above his left eyebrow that I had noticed myself the very first time Renee brought him around to meet me.
Dante Cole, I said out loud, more to myself than to Cornell. Cornell nodded slow. Whoever this man actually is, he has been somebody else at least 3 times that I can find, just looking quick this morning. And I imagine there's more names out there I have not turned up yet. He pulled a notepad toward him and started writing down what he had found. His handwriting small and neat. The same handwriting he used to use writing up reports back when he carried a badge every day. He circled the Ohio address twice. This one here, he said, tapping the pen against the paper. Cleveland.
That's the most recent one before Michigan. 4 years back is not that long ago, Leon. Somebody in that city is going to remember a man who looked like this going by, Damon Reese, doing whatever it was he was doing there before he showed up here as Dante Cole.
I asked him what he thought that might have been.
Cornell leaned back in his chair and rubbed a hand slow across his jaw, the same way he used to do right before he delivered bad news to a family standing in his office all those years he ran that precinct.
I don't know yet, he said. But a man does not change his name 3 times across 3 states unless he is running from something or running towards something he does not want traced back to him. And a man who studies your handwriting close enough to fake your signature on a bank document, that is not a man improvising. That is a man with practice. He looked at me, steady across the desk, his face serious in a way I had not seen from him since the day he told me and Josephine our old neighbor's boy had been found, after 3 days missing some 20 years back now. I need you to understand something, Leon, he said. I do not think this is the first time he has done this. Not the way he moves, not the way he already knew the square footage of your garage without you telling him, not the way he waited until the exact right moment to come around your daughter. This is a man who has done this before, somewhere, to somebody. We just have not found who yet. He picked up his phone and started dialing a number from an old contact list taped inside his desk drawer. A name I did not recognize. Somebody, he said, still worked cases out of Cleveland even after all these years.
Give me a few days, he said, covering the receiver with his hand for a moment.
I'm going to find out exactly who Damon Reese was to somebody out there, and what happened to whoever he left behind.
3 days passed before Cornell called me back.
3 days I spent going through the motions of an old man mourning his wife, while Dante and Renee moved through my house like it already belonged to them. I kept the pendant hidden in a coffee can out in the shop, buried under a drawer of old spark plugs nobody but me ever touched anymore. Checking on it every morning before opening the bay doors,
Cornell asked me to meet him at the shop instead of his office that time. Said he wanted to talk somewhere with engine noise loud enough to cover a conversation if anybody happened to walk by outside. I unlocked the bay doors that Thursday afternoon and let him in through the side, same as I used to let customers in after hours, back when business was slow enough that a man had time for that kind of thing.
He sat down on the stool beside my workbench, the same stool Josephine used to sit on sometimes in the evenings, keeping me company, while I finished up a job before supper. He had a folder tucked under his arm, thicker than the notes he had shown me before.
My contact in Cleveland, he said, a retired detective named Ruth Alvarez.
Good as they come. She remembered the name the second I said it over the phone. Damon Reese. Said it like tasting something sour.
He opened the folder and slid a printed page across the workbench toward me.
A woman's face looked back at me from a newspaper clipping. Older, kind eyes, a church hat pinned careful to gray hair. Willa Mae Jenkins Cornell said, 68 years old, widow. Owned a duplex on the east side of Cleveland, free and clear, no mortgage. Paid off over 30 years working as a hospital administrator. Died 4 years back. Found at the bottom of her basement stairs by a neighbor who came by to check on her.
I felt something cold move through my chest. Hearing that, the same staircase, the same kind of fall, the same age, near enough to my own wife's.
Ruth worked that case herself, Cornell said.
ruled an accident at a time, nothing on the surface to say otherwise. But about 8 months before Mrs. Jenkins died, her grandson had brought a man around calling himself Damon Reese. Said he was helping the family look at reverse mortgage options on the property, easing the burden on an old woman living alone in a house too big for her. I asked him if the grandson knew this Damon Reese was actually the same man now going by Dante Cole. Cornell shook his head slow. Grandson moved to Texas not long after his grandmother passed. Ruth tried reaching him for me this morning, no answer yet. But Leon, listen to this part, close, he said, tapping the folder twice before he opened it back up.
He pulled another sheet from the folder, a photocopy of a property record.
6 weeks after Mrs. Jenkins died, the duplex sold. Quick sale, cash buyer, well below market value. Ruth pulled the paperwork this morning. The buyer was a shell company registered out of Delaware, dissolved less than a year later once the property flipped again for nearly triple what it sold for the first time. I sat down on an overturned bucket across from him, my legs suddenly less steady than they had been standing at the workbench.
Somebody made a lot of money off that woman dying when she did, Cornell said.
And Damon Reese disappeared from Cleveland records completely about 2 months after that sale went through. Next time anybody official has him on paper anywhere, he shows up in Michigan 4 years later as Dante Cole. Clean record, fresh start. Dante Cole. I said out loud, more to myself than to Cornell, the name sitting strange in my mouth now that I knew what it was hiding. I asked him straight out if he thought Dante had killed that woman himself, or just profited off whatever happened to him. Cornell was quiet a long moment, turning a wrench over in his hands, feeling the weight of it without really looking at it. I think a man does not build a pattern like this by accident, Leon. Meet a family through somebody vulnerable, get close, learn the finances. Wait for an old woman living alone to have some kind of fall. Nobody can prove was anything but bad luck. Then move the property, fast, before anybody starts asking real questions. I think that takes practice. I think Willa Mae Jenkins might not be the first either. Just the first one I have found so far, with a name attached to a face that matches. He closed the folder and looked at me steady across the workbench, the fluorescent light overhead humming faint the way it always did in that shop. I am going to keep pulling on this thread, he said. Ruth is going to try that grandson again tomorrow, and she is checking 2 other counties nearby for anything similar in the last 10 years. But Leon, I need you to hear me on something important right now. I told him I was listening, and I meant it. Every day you wait to move against this man is another day your daughter stays tangled up with somebody who has already done this once before and gotten away clean with it. We are not just protecting your money anymore, Leon. We are racing a clock we cannot see the face of, and I do not know how much time is left on it. He stood up from the stool and put his hand on my shoulder before he left, same as he had done outside the church 3 weeks earlier, and told me to keep the pendant somewhere even safer than a coffee can. Someplace nobody in that house would ever think to look twice. I told him I would find someplace better before nightfall, and after he left, I sat alone in the shop a long while, listening to the quiet. Renee came by the house alone on a Sunday afternoon. No Dante trailing behind her for once, no reason given ahead of time for the visit. I was out back, near the garden Josephine used to keep, pulling up the last of the dead tomato vines before the frost took what little was left of them, when I heard her car pull into the driveway. She found me out there with dirt still on my hands and sat down on the old bench Josephine and I had bought at a yard sale 20 years back, the wood gone gray and soft with weather. She did not say much at first, just watched me work for a while, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "You doing all right out here, Daddy?" she asked, eventually. I told her I was managing, same as any man manages when his hands have work to do and his mind has other things it would rather not sit still with. She was quiet again for a minute. Then she said, "Daddy, I know sometimes Dante comes across a certain way. Pushy, maybe, business-minded. But he's not trying to hurt anybody. He's just trying to help us get ahead, get ourselves set up right before it's too late to do it easy." I did not ask her what she meant by too late. I kept pulling vines, letting her keep talking, if she wanted to keep talking. "He's had a hard life," she said, her voice softer now,
almost pleading with me to understand something I had not asked her to explain. Family troubles growing up. Moved around a lot as a kid, never really had anybody looking out for him the way you always looked out for me. I think that's part of why he holds on to money the way he does, why he thinks about these things so much. He's scared of ending up with nothing again. I set the last of the dead vines into a pile beside the fence and sat down next to her on the bench, my knees complaining the whole way down. "Renee," I said, "you don't have to explain that man to me. I see him fine on my own." She looked over at me, quick, something flickering across her face I could not quite name. Somewhere between hurt and fear. "I didn't mean it like that, Daddy. I just don't want you two at odds with each other. Not now. Not with everything else going on." I told her I was not at odds with anybody, that I was just an old man, tired from the yard work, nothing more complicated than that. She reached over and took my dirty hand in both of hers, not caring about the soil still caught under my nails. "Daddy, I need you to trust me on this. I know it looks fast, us moving quick on things, but Dante has good reasons for everything he does. I promise you that." Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket right then, sharp and sudden enough that she jumped a little in her seat. She pulled it out, fast, faster than a person pulls out a phone for a call they were expecting. And I caught a glimpse of the screen before she could turn it away from me. A name sat there across the top, lit up bright against the dark screen. Not Dante. A name I had never once heard Renee mention in 8 months of her bringing that man around my house. Marcus. She stood up quick from the bench, thumbing the screen dark before I could read anything more than that first name, and told me she needed to take this outside, that it was work, a client matter that could not wait. I watched her walk toward the far end of the yard, phone pressed tight against her ear, her voice dropping low enough that the wind carried away whatever words she was actually saying. She kept her back to me the whole time, same as she had done at the funeral, answering that first call near the church doors. I sat there on that bench a long while after she started talking, turning the name over slow in my mind. Marcus. The same first name written on that bank statement hidden inside Josephine's sewing box. The same name attached to whoever had been quietly draining my retirement account for the better part of 8 months running. It could have been nothing. Marcus was not so uncommon a name that hearing it once meant anything certain at all. But sitting there watching my daughter pace the far end of that yard, her voice too careful, her shoulders too tense for an ordinary work call on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, I found myself unable to make myself believe it was nothing. When she came back a few minutes later, her face had smoothed itself back into something calm, something practiced. She told me she had to get going, that she had forgotten about an appointment. She kissed my cheek quick and said she loved me, same words she always said, and walked back to her car without once looking back toward the garden. I sat there until her car had turned the corner out of sight, the cold finally starting to settle into my joints, wondering how many other calls like that one she had taken over the last 8 months without me ever once catching a glimpse of the name lighting up her screen. Cornell called on a Wednesday morning, earlier than he usually called, early enough that I was still standing at the stove making a single cup of coffee, the way I had learned to make it for just myself again, after 42 years of making 2 cups every morning without thinking twice about it. "Leon," he said, no greeting. First, straight into it. The way he talked when something weighed heavy on him. Ruth reached that grandson yesterday evening. Took some convincing, but he finally called her back. I asked him what the grandson had told her. "Boy's name is Terrell Cornell," said. 26 years old now, was 22 when his grandmother died. Said he still thinks about it most days. Still blames himself some for bringing that man around in the first place. Said Damon Reese showed up to one of his grandmother's church functions with somebody else's wife on his arm. Real charming, real polished. Talked about property values and reverse mortgages like he'd read every book on the subject there was to read. I turned the burner off under my coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, the phone pressed close against my ear. Terrell said his grandmother trusted the man almost right away, Cornell went on. Said Damon had a way of remembering little things about people. Birthdays, favorite foods,
Small stuff that made an old woman feel seen by somebody younger than her own family. Sometimes managed to make her feel, same thing you told me about him remembering things around your house, Leon. The square footage, the ceiling height, all that.
I told him that sounded exactly like the man sitting in my kitchen most evenings now. Exactly like the man my own daughter had brought home. There's something else, Cornell said, and his voice dropped into that careful register he used whenever the next thing out of his mouth mattered more than the rest. Ruth pulled the coroner's report from back then, the full one, not just the summary that made it into any paperwork the family saw. Mrs. Jenkins had bruising on her wrist and forearm that never got explained in the final ruling. Not the kind of bruising you get catching yourself on a railing during a fall, the kind you get when somebody grabs hold of you first. I did not say anything for a long moment, my hand tightening around my coffee cup until my knuckles ached with it.
Ruth said at the time, nobody pushed hard enough to reopen it, Cornell said. Case looked clean enough on the surface. Family was grieving and did not want to drag things out in court, and Damon Reese was already 3 states away by the time anybody might have thought to ask him a single question. He walked away clean. Leon, same as he is fixing to walk away clean from whatever he has planned for you.
I asked him what he thought I should do now, hearing all of this laid out plain in front of me. Cornell was quiet a moment before he answered.
Legally, right now, we do not have enough to bring to anybody. A forged signature, a pattern of names, a 4-year-old case nobody reopened. A good lawyer could stretch all of that out into nothing for months, maybe years, while this man keeps right on working your daughter and keeps right on working you. And Leon, I do not think you have years to spare waiting on a system that already let that woman down once.
I told him I understood that much myself, that I had been feeling the weight of that same clock ticking since the day he first called me outside that church.
Then here is what I think, Cornell said. I think we stop waiting on proof falling into our laps and start building a situation where he hands us the proof himself. On his own thinking, he is the one in control of it.
I asked him what he meant by that exactly. A man like this, he does not slow down once he smells money close enough to touch, Cornell said.
He has been patient with you these past weeks because patient is what the plan called for. But if you give him a reason to believe the payoff is closer than he thought, closer and bigger, he will move fast, careless, fast. The kind of fast that makes mistakes.
I thought about the pendant sitting hidden now inside an old tool case in the shop, wrapped in a shop rag where nobody would think to look twice at it. I thought about the recording still waiting inside it, whatever Josephine had managed to capture before she died. I sat with that thought a long moment, picturing my own shop, the smell of oil and rubber, the corner where I had taught Renee to check a tire pressure herself. The same place a man might come thinking he was walking into easy money, and walk out into something else entirely. We are going to have to draw him out, Cornell said.
Get him somewhere we control, somewhere with eyes and ears already in place, and give him something too good for a man like that to walk away from without showing us exactly who he really is.
I asked him where a man like that could possibly be drawn to feel safe enough to show his true hand.
Cornell was quiet a moment, and then he said the answer plain, like it had been sitting there waiting the whole time for either of us to say it out loud first.
Your shop, Leon. The one place in this whole city that still belongs to you.
Free and clear, with nobody's name on the deed but yours.
Cornell asked me if I trusted him enough to help set it up right, start to finish, and I told him, after everything he had already done to help me these past weeks, trust was not even a question worth asking anymore. Dante showed up on Saturday morning with a leather folder tucked under his arm.
The kind of folder that looked like it cost more than a week of groceries, and set it down on my kitchen table like he owned the space he was setting it on. Renee trailed in behind him, carrying a bag of bagels from the bakery on Livernois, not quite meeting my eyes as she set them down beside the folder.
"Morning, Mr. Ashworth," Dante said, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from me without waiting to be asked.
"Got some paperwork here we need to go through together. Power of attorney documents, just standard stuff to make sure things run smooth if anything ever happens where you can't make decisions for yourself right quick."
I asked him what kind of things he meant by that. "Medical situations mostly," he said, opening the folder and sliding a stack of papers toward me. Financial decisions too, if it ever comes to that. Renee wants to make sure she can act fast on your behalf. No waiting on courts or lawyers if something were to happen, sudden, God forbid. You know how it goes with folks our parents' age. Better to have it settled now than scrambling later. I reached into my shirt pocket for my reading glasses and came up empty. I patted my other pocket, then my jacket hanging on the back of the chair, making a show of searching that took longer than it needed to. Where'd I put those darn glasses? I muttered, half to myself, pushing back from the table to check the counter, then the windowsill, then the drawer by the stove, where I never actually kept them. Renee sighed softly, the kind of sigh a person lets out when they're trying not to sound impatient. "Daddy, they're probably upstairs. Want me to go grab them?" I told her not to trouble herself, that I'd manage without them for now, and sat back down, squinting at the top page like a man straining to make out words that refused to hold still. Dante tapped the page with one finger. "Take your time. But we do need this signed and notarized by end of week, Mr. Ashworth. I already got a notary lined up for Friday afternoon. Real convenient. Comes right to the house." I leaned in close over the paper, my nose nearly touching the ink, and asked him to read me the second paragraph out loud, since my eyes weren't cooperating this morning. He read it fast, flat, skipping over the parts that mattered most, the way a man reads something he's hoping you won't ask questions about. I nodded along like I was following every word, then reached for my coffee cup sitting close by my elbow. My hand caught the edge of the folder instead of the cup handle, a clumsy, deliberate mistake, and the whole cup tipped forward. Dark coffee spreading fast across the top 3 pages before anybody could grab for a napkin. Dante shot up out of his chair so fast it scraped hard against the floor. "Come on, man," he said, snatching the papers back, coffee dripping off the edges onto his slacks. "These were originals." "I am sorry, so sorry," I said, my voice wobbling just enough, my hands fluttering uselessly over the mess, like I didn't know where to start cleaning it. My hand, it just slipped right there. I don't know what happened. Renee grabbed a dish towel and started blotting at the pages, though the ink had already started bleeding through in long brown streaks. "It's fine, Dante," she said. "We'll just print new ones." Dante stood there a second longer, jaw tight, staring down at the ruined papers before he forced something like a smile back onto his face. "It's all right, Mr. Ashworth. Accidents happen. I'll get Gavin to run us a fresh set Monday." He gathered the soaked papers into a pile and set them aside on the counter to dry, muttering under his breath about how the notary would need to be rescheduled now, how that pushed everything back at least 3 or 4 days. Then, still frustrated, still not quite thinking clean, he said something that made me go still inside, even as I kept my face loose and confused on the outside. "We can't afford to keep pushing this," he said, mostly to Renee, but loud enough for me to hear plain. "That shop alone is sitting on prime corner lot, easy 210, 220 with the equipment included. We start bleeding time, some developer beats us to making an offer first." Renee shot him a look, quick and sharp, the kind of look that told him he'd said more than he meant to say in front of me. Dante caught it a half-second too late and cleared his throat, turning back to gathering up the ruined papers like nothing had happened at all. I sat there quiet, patting at the spilled coffee with my own napkin, letting my face stay slack and confused. But inside my head, that number sat sharp and clear. $220,000. A number a stranger has no business knowing off the top of his head about a shop he'd supposedly only heard about 8 months ago. Later that evening, alone in my bedroom with the door shut, I pulled out the small notebook I'd started keeping in my jacket pocket and wrote the number down plain, along with the date and the exact words he'd used. Prime corner lot. 210, 220 with equipment included. A man does not know numbers like that unless somebody has already walked that lot with a calculator in hand. Cornell came by the shop a little after midnight on Tuesday, driving his old truck with the headlights off the last block before he turned into the lot, same as we'd agreed on the phone that afternoon. I let him in through the side door and locked it again behind him, the way we'd done every time since this whole thing started needing secrecy. He was carrying a duffel bag heavier than it looked, and he set it down on my workbench, careful, like the contents inside mattered more than the bag itself let on. Inside were 4 small cameras, no bigger than a thumb, along with a couple of wireless microphones and a little black box he said would record everything straight to a hard drive instead of the cloud. No chance of anybody hacking in or pulling records with a warrant before we were ready.
Got these off a buddy who does security work for jewelry stores downtown.
Cornell said, pulling one of the cameras out and turning it over in his hand. Small enough, nobody notices them unless they're looking dead at it up close. We put one covering the front counter, one on the office door, one up in that corner by the tire rack looking down over the whole bay, and one right here at this bench, close enough to catch faces clear if anybody's standing near it. I asked him how long it would take to get them all running proper.
Couple hours, he said. I've done this kind of work before, back when I still carried a badge. Wiring's the slow part, making sure nothing looks fresh or out of place come morning. We worked through the night, mostly quiet him up on the stepladder, running wire along the ceiling beams. Me holding the ladder steady and handing him tools when he called for them. Same as I'd done for other men working in that shop for 38 years. It felt strange doing this kind of work in my own place, hiding things instead of fixing things. Out in the open the way I always had. Around 2 in the morning, we sat down on the same 2 stools we always used, and Cornell pulled out a legal pad, the kind with the yellow paper, and started sketching out how the whole thing needed to play out. We can't just invite them here and expect him to talk, Cornell said. Man like that, he's careful. He needs a reason, good enough that greed pushes past whatever caution he's got left in him.
I asked him what kind of reason he had in mind. Cornell tapped the pen against the pad a few times, thinking. What if Josephine left something behind? He said, slow, like he was testing the idea out loud before committing to it. Insurance savings. Something substantial enough that a man desperate for money can't help himself but show up and show his hand trying to get at it. I thought about that a moment, turning it over the way I'd turn over a part I wasn't sure would fit right. I told him Josephine and I never had that kind of money sitting anywhere, not close to it. And Renee would know that better than anybody, seeing as she'd handled some of our paperwork over the years herself.
That's exactly why it works, Cornell said. You tell them you found something you didn't know existed, a policy Josephine took out on her own, quiet, without telling you, the kind of thing a careful woman sometimes does, without her husband knowing every detail of her business. Say it's worth $400,000, maybe more. Enough that a man drowning in whatever debts he's carrying can't walk away from it, even if some part of him smells something off about how sudden it is.
I sat with that a long moment, picturing Renee's face hearing a number like that. Picturing what it might do to her before we even got to the truth sitting underneath it. It's going to hurt her hearing that lie before she hears everything else I said. Cornell nodded slow, not disagreeing with me on that point. It will. But Leon, she's going to hurt a lot worse if we let this drag on, and something happens to you the way it happened to Mrs. Jenkins. Sometimes protecting somebody means letting them feel a smaller cut now, so they don't bleed out later. I sat quiet a while, turning that around in my head, before I finally nodded and told him to write it down, plain, exactly how I wanted to say it to them. We spent the next hour working out the words together, careful, the same way I used to plan out a difficult repair before ever touching a wrench to it. I would tell them I'd been going through Josephine's old files that week, grieving, restless, unable to sleep, and had come across a life insurance policy she'd taken out years back through her old teachers' union, one neither of us had ever mentioned because she'd forgotten about it herself until the paperwork surfaced. $400,000, payable directly to me as beneficiary, needing only a meeting with the insurance representative to finalize the claim. Cornell said he'd play that representative himself, dress the part, meeting us right here at the shop, instead of some office, claiming it was standard practice for claims involving cash transfers of that size, wanting to verify identity and property both in person before releasing funds. By the time we finished going over every detail twice, the sky outside the bay windows had started turning that pale gray color it turns before sunrise. Cornell packed up his tools and shook my hand at the door, telling me to call Renee first thing that morning. Casual, not urgent. Just an old man wanting his daughter to come by soon, because he'd found something of her mother's he needed to show her. I stood alone in the shop a while after he left, looking around at the cameras now hidden in plain sight, wondering if Josephine would understand why her husband was about to lie to their only daughter, using her own memory as the bait. Cornell called me back that same afternoon, not long after I'd phoned Renee to tell her I needed her to come by the shop soon, that I'd found something of her mother's worth talking about. He wanted to walk through the plan one more time before we committed to a date. He said, make sure I was steady in my own mind about what we were fixing to do. I met him at the shop again that evening, just the two of us, the bay doors shut and the lights turned low enough that anybody passing on the street wouldn't think twice about an empty building. He sat on his usual stool and didn't say anything for a while, just looked at me steady, the way he used to look at witnesses before asking them the question that mattered most. Leon, he said, finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think before you answer it. Are you sure about doing this to Renee? Sitting her down, letting her believe a lie about her mother? Watching her face while she hears it? Because once we start this, there's no taking it back, Gentle. She's going to remember this day for the rest of her life, one way or another. I sat down across from him and thought about that a long moment before I answered. I've asked myself that same question every night since I found that letter in Josephine's sewing box, I told him. And every time I land in the same place, that girl is my daughter. She came out of my wife's body, and I held her the first night she was born, and I have loved her every single day since, even on the days she made that hard to do. I am not doing this to hurt her, Cornell. I am doing this because I don't know any other way to save her from a man who has already killed once, maybe more than once, and who is circling her right now, the same patient way he circled that woman in Cleveland before she ended up dead at the bottom of her own stairs. Cornell nodded, slow listening. If I sit back and do nothing, I said, if I let this play out, soft and easy, just to spare her feelings today, and something happens to her, the way it happened to Josephine, I will never forgive myself as long as I live, however long that turns out to be. I would rather she be angry with me for a year, 5 years, however long it takes her to understand why I did this, than have to bury her the way I just buried her mother. Cornell was quiet a moment, turning that over. All right, he said. Then we do it clean, and we do it careful, and we make sure when this is over she knows the truth was never about hurting her. It was about the only man in her life who was never going to lie to her about anything that mattered. We spent the next hour going back over every detail, tightening up the parts that still felt loose. Cornell would arrive at the shop dressed as the insurance representative, carrying a folder with real-looking documents he'd have a friend print up that could pass a glance from across a table. He would ask for identification from everyone in the room, standard procedure he'd claim, which would give us a clean reason to have Dante's full legal name on record before anything else happened. I would let the conversation run long enough for Dante to reveal himself in his own words, same as he'd already started doing with careless comments about the shop's value. And the recording, Cornell said, tapping the small silver pendant I'd brought with me that evening, still wrapped in its shop rag. Have you managed to get anything off it yet? I told him I had not, that I did not know the first thing about pulling audio off a device that small, and that some part of me was afraid to try alone, afraid of what I might hear once I finally did. Cornell said he knew somebody, a young man, who did technical work for the department sometimes, who owed him a favor from years back, and who could pull whatever was on that little recorder without a single question asked about why. He said he'd reach out first thing in the morning. We settled on Thursday evening for the meeting itself, 4 days out, enough time to get everything ready without giving Dante and Renee room to grow suspicious of the delay. I would call Renee again in the morning to confirm. Keep my voice light, keep the excitement in it, believable. An old man, excited about unexpected money showing up after so much loss. Cornell left a little after 10 that night, telling me to get some rest, that Thursday was going to be a long day for both of us. I sat alone in the shop a while longer after his truck pulled out of the lot, running my thumb over the edge of the workbench, same wood I'd been running my hands over for 38 years. My phone buzzed against the metal of the bench a little before midnight, the sound sharp in the quiet shop. I picked it up, expecting maybe Cornell forgetting to mention something. It was a text message instead, from the same unknown number that had called me twice on the day of the funeral, the number I had never called back, the number I had let go both times without answering. The message was 3 words long, sitting there and glowing on my screen in the dark shop. I know everything. I did not sleep after that text came through. I sat on the stool in the shop until the sky outside turned pale, staring at those 3 words, until they stopped looking like words at all and just became shapes on a screen. I thought about calling the number back a dozen times that night and talked myself out of it every single time, afraid of what answering might set loose before I was ready for it. Renee showed up at the shop a little after 7 that morning, before I'd even had the chance to lock up and head home for breakfast. I heard her car pull in, fast tires catching gravel, and by the time I turned around from the workbench, she was already standing in the open bay door, still in the same clothes she must have slept in, if she'd slept at all. Her eyes were red and swollen, the kind of red that comes from crying most of the night, not the kind that comes from allergies or dust. She did not say anything at first. She just stood there in the doorway, arms wrapped tight around herself against the morning cold. "Daddy," she said finally, her voice thin and cracked. "That text last night, that was me." I set down the wrench in my hand, slow, and asked her what she meant, though some part of me had already started putting the pieces together the moment I saw her face. "I got a second phone a few months back," she said, walking further into the shop, her steps unsteady. "A prepaid one, cash only, nothing tied to my name. I used it to call you that night because I couldn't say it to your face yet, and I couldn't say it on my regular phone either, in case he ever went through it." I asked her careful in case whoever went through it. She sat down hard on the same stool Cornell usually used, her hands shaking in her lap. "Dante," she said, "Daddy, I've known something wasn't right for months now, since the summer, maybe longer. I just didn't want it to be true. Bad enough that I convinced myself it wasn't." I did not say anything. I let her keep talking the way Cornell had taught me to let people talk themselves toward the truth, instead of pulling it out of them too fast. "I saw him going through your bank papers back in July," she said. Told myself he was just helping, same as he always says. But then I heard him on the phone one night, late, thought I was asleep. He was talking to somebody he called Marcus, real casual, like they'd known each other years. Talking about timing, about accounts, about somebody named Ashworth, like it was a business deal instead of my own family. My chest went tight hearing her say that name out loud. The same name, written in Josephine's careful handwriting, inside that brown envelope. I asked her if she had ever asked him about it directly. She shook her head, tears starting again sliding down a face already worn thin from crying. "I was scared to, Daddy. You don't know what it's like being 34 years old and divorced, already feeling like nobody's ever going to want you again the way Marcus wanted. The way Dante made me feel wanted, at least at first. I told myself if I asked the wrong question, I'd lose that and I'd be alone again. And I couldn't stand the thought of being alone again after everything with my ex." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "And then Mama died, and it all got so much worse, so much faster than I could keep up with. And I just kept telling myself it wasn't what it looked like, because the alternative was too much to hold." I reached over and took her hand. The same hand I used to hold crossing streets when she was small enough to need me for that. "Renee," I said, "did you know he was planning something with your mama before she passed?" She looked up at me sharp, something like horror crossing her face. "No, Daddy, God, no. I swear to you, I did not know anything about that, nothing about Mama specifically. I just knew something was off with the money, with him, with all of it. I should have said something sooner. I should have protected you both instead of protecting myself." I sat with that a long moment, watching my daughter fall apart in front of me. In the same shop where I taught her to change her first tire at 16 years old. "Did your mama know about this second phone?" I asked her. "Did she ever come to you asking questions close to the end?" Renee shook her head slow, wiping at her face with her sleeve. "No. If she knew something, she never told me. I think she was trying to protect me, the same way I've been trying to protect myself.
Foolish, both of us, thinking silence was some kind of shield.
I told her it was not foolish, that fear made fools of braver people than either one of them, myself included, some days. She looked up at me, then something desperate in her eyes.
Daddy, what do we do now? What happens to Mama's memory, to me, to any of it?
I stood up slow and walked over to the workbench, my hand resting on the edge of it where Cornell and I had sat planning half the night through. You'll know everything tonight, I told her. Everything. I know everything Cornell and I have found these past weeks. But right now, I need you to help me with one thing first, and I need you to trust me the way I'm choosing to trust you. Thursday evening came faster than I expected it to, the way important days always seem to rush toward you once you've committed to them. I spent the afternoon setting the shop in order, wiping down the workbench, making sure the folding table Cornell and I had set up near the tire rack looked like nothing more than an ordinary spot for a business conversation. Nothing staged about it at all. Renee arrived first a little before 6, her face composed now in a way it had not been that morning, though I could see the effort it took her to hold it steady. She had agreed that morning to help me by acting normal in front of Dante, by not letting on that anything between us had shifted since our conversation at dawn. She hugged me quick at the door and whispered that she was scared, and I told her I was too, and that being scared together was better than being scared alone. Dante pulled up 20 minutes later in his car, stepping out slow, glancing around the lot like a man checking his surroundings, out of habit more than suspicion. He came in wearing a sport coat over his usual shirt, dressed up more than the occasion called for, and I understood then that greed had already started working on him, the way Cornell said it would. "Evening, Mr. Ashworth," he said, shaking my hand with both of his, this time warmer than he'd ever shaken it before. "Renee tells me you found something of Josephine's worth talking about." I told him to sit down at the folding table, that it was easier to explain sitting than standing, and the three of us took our seats. Renee between us, her hands folded tight in her lap, the same way they'd been folded in the church pew weeks earlier. I went through it slow, the way Cornell and I had practiced. I told them I'd been going through Josephine's old files in a box she kept from her teaching years, unable to sleep most nights since the funeral, needing something to keep my hands busy. I told them I'd found paperwork from her old teachers' union, a life insurance policy she must have taken out quiet years back. One she'd never once mentioned to me in over 40 years of marriage. $400,000, I said, letting my voice catch a little on the number. Same as a man's voice might catch for real hearing news like that. Payable to me direct, soon as the claim clears. Dante's whole posture changed hearing that number. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. Something bright and hungry flickering behind his eyes, before he remembered to arrange his face into something more careful, more concerned. Wow, Mr. Ashworth, that's a lot of money, he said. Josephine never mentioned anything like that to either of you. I told him she must have kept it private, same as some folks keep certain things private, even from the people closest to them. Renee stayed quiet beside me, staring down at her hands, playing her part exactly as we'd rehearsed it that afternoon. There's a representative from the insurance company coming by tonight, I told them. Wanted to meet in person, verify a few things before releasing the funds. Should be here any minute now. Right on cue, headlights swept across the front window as Cornell's car pulled into the lot. He walked in a few minutes later, dressed in a gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase, looking every bit the part of an insurance man doing his job on a late Thursday evening. He introduced himself with a name that was not his own and shook hands all around, businesslike, unhurried. "Sorry for the late hour," Cornell said, setting his briefcase on the table and pulling out a folder of papers that looked official enough to pass a glance. Company likes these verified in person for amounts this size, especially when there's, unusual circumstances involved. I'll just need identification from everyone present. Standard procedure. Dante pulled out his wallet without hesitation, sliding his license across the table, and I watched Cornell study it a beat longer than necessary, memorizing whatever name sat printed there for the record. While Cornell worked through his folder of documents, asking careful questions about beneficiaries and account numbers, I noticed something shift in Dante's posture. Small at first, then more obvious. His eyes kept drifting toward the shop's front door, toward the deadbolt Cornell had turned without anybody quite noticing when he walked in. "Something wrong, Dante?" I asked him, my voice mild. He forced a smile back onto his face. No, just, this is a lot of good news all at once, that's all. Little overwhelming." Cornell closed his folder and looked between the three of us, his expression shifting slightly, something colder settling behind his professional manner. "Before we finalize anything," he said, "there's actually one more piece of verification the company likes to review, given the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Ashworth's passing. It's standard when a policyholder's death was recent and somewhat unexpected." Dante's jaw tightened at that, just barely, but I caught it. Same as I'd caught the notebook under his arm the very first night out of my garage. I stood up slow from the table and walked over to the wall where the shop's old projector screen hung. The one I used sometimes to show customers diagrams of engine parts they needed replaced. I pulled the screen down and switched on the small projector Cornell had rigged up 2 nights before. "This won't take long," I said, my voice steady now in a way it had not been steady in weeks. "Just something I think everybody at this table needs to see." The projector hummed to life against the screen, throwing a soft rectangle of light across the shop wall. I had asked Cornell's young contact 3 days earlier to pull whatever sat recorded on that little silver pendant, and he had done it clean, transferring the audio onto a simple black slide with nothing but a date stamp glowing at the corner. December the 9th. 2 days before Josephine died. I pressed the button on the small remote Cornell had left on the table. The room filled with sound instead of picture, just audio. Josephine's voice coming through clear and close, the way it sounded when she stood near enough to touch. "You need to leave my house," Josephine said, her voice steady, no fear in it, yet only warning. "I found the statements, Marcus. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know what I'm talking about." Dante went rigid in his chair. Renee's hand flew to her mouth beside me. A man's voice answered, lower, familiar, even through the recording. The same voice that had called me old man outside a church 3 weeks earlier. "Mrs. Ashworth, you're confused. My name is Dante." "Boy, I have been alive 68 years, Josephine said. "I know exactly who I'm looking at. And I know exactly what you did in Cleveland to that poor woman. Willa Mae Jenkins. Did you even remember her name after you finished with her? Or did you move on too fast to bother?" There was a pause on the recording long enough that the shop around us felt like it had stopped breathing entirely. "You don't know what you're talking about," Dante said, his recorded voice tighter now, losing its polish. "I know you've been stealing from my husband for months," Josephine said. "I know you put your hands on his signature and made it lie for you. And I know you are not leaving this family until somebody stops you. So I am telling you now, plain, you are done here. I am calling Leon's lawyer in the morning, and I am calling the police right behind him." Something scraped hard against a wooden surface, a sound like a hand slamming down. "Lower your voice," Dante said, his recorded voice dropping into something meaner than anything I had ever heard from him sitting at my table. Or what Josephine answered. "Not backing down an inch. 68 years of raising a daughter and teaching other people's children, showing plain in every word. You'll do to me what you did to her." There was a scuffle, then fast, chaotic, the recording catching only fragments. Josephine's voice sharp. "Get your hands off me!" A crash of something falling, then footsteps hurried, and a sound that made my stomach drop clean through the floor. A heavy, terrible thud, followed by silence. Then Josephine's voice again, weaker now, further from the pendant, strained in a way that told me everything I never wanted to know about her last minutes. "Leon will find out. He will find out, and you will never touch him." The recording ended there. The projector screen going dark, the shop silent, except for the low hum of the machine still running. Renee was sobbing beside me, her hands pressed against her face. Dante shot up out of his chair so fast it toppled backward onto the concrete floor. "That's fake," he said, his voice cracking, spinning toward the door. "That's some kind of trick. That's not real. You can't prove any of that came from her." He grabbed the door handle and yanked hard. It did not move. Cornell had turned the deadbolt the moment he walked in that evening, same as we'd planned. "Let me out!" Dante shouted, pulling again, harder. his composure gone completely, now replaced by something raw and frightened underneath it. Cornell stood up slow from the table, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a badge I had not known he still carried, holding it up plain for Dante to see. Detroit Police Department, retired, working this case in cooperation with an active detective, he said, his voice suddenly nothing like the mild insurance representative he had played all evening. Your real name is Marcus Delray Whitfield. You also went by Damon Reese in Cleveland, Ohio, and Terrence Boykin in Savannah, Georgia. Sit back down. Dante backed against the locked door instead, his eyes darting around the shop like he was looking for another way out that did not exist. Blue and red lights swept across the front windows a moment later. Silent, no sirens, just the quiet arrival of 2 patrol cars pulling into the lot, exactly on the schedule Cornell had arranged that afternoon. 2 officers stepped out and walked toward the door, and Cornell moved past Dante to unlock it himself, letting them in. They read him his rights, standing right there beside the tire rack, the same corner where I had taught Renee how to check her own oil at 16 years old. Dante did not fight them when they cuffed him. He just kept saying it wasn't real, that we'd set him up, that none of it would hold in any court. Renee stood frozen through all of it, tears streaming steady down her face, watching the man she had loved get led out of my shop in handcuffs. When the door finally closed behind the last officer, the shop went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not once in 38 years. She turned to me slow, her whole body trembling. "Daddy," she said, her voice breaking apart on every word. "You knew about the recording. You knew what was on it. You knew this whole time, and you let me sit at that table, not knowing what I was about to hear." I stood there looking at my daughter, unable yet to find the words that might explain to her why silence had felt like the only kind of mercy I had left to offer. I did not answer her right away. I pulled out the folding chair Dante had knocked over and set it upright again, giving my hands something to do while I found the words I needed. Cornell stepped outside to speak with the officers a while longer, leaving Renee and me alone in the shop for the first time since everything had come apart. "I did not tell you," I said finally, "because the moment you knew, you would not have been able to sit across that table from him and act like nothing had changed. And if he had seen even a flicker of that in your face, Renee, he might have run before Cornell ever got that door locked. I needed you sitting there calm, so he would stay calm too, right up until it was too late for him to do anything about it." She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, her breathing still uneven. "So you used me," she said, not quite an accusation, more like she was testing the words to see how much they hurt, saying them out loud. "I used the situation," I told her, "not you. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." She sat back down slow in the chair across from me, the same chair she'd been sitting in when Josephine's voice first came through those speakers. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Not just about him, about all of it. The money, the other woman in Cleveland, all of it." I told her the truth, start to finish, same as I'd promised her that morning. I told her about Cornell's call the day of the funeral, about the sewing box and the letter your mother left for me, about the withdrawals going back 8 months, about Willa Mae Jenkins and the bruising the coroner never explained, about the pendant sitting in a coffee can full of spark plugs for 2 weeks while I worked up the nerve to find out what was recorded on it. She listened to all of it without interrupting, her hands twisting a napkin in her lap until it tore clean in half, without her seeming to notice. "Mama knew," Renee said, finally, her voice small. "She knew, and she still went to confront him herself. Instead of calling you first, instead of calling the police first. I think your mother spent 42 years believing she could handle anything on her own, if it meant protecting the people she loved," I said. "I think that's exactly what killed her. She wanted to stop him, quiet, clean, before either one of us ever had to know how close we'd come to losing everything. She just ran out of time to do it the safe way." Renee started crying again, different this time. Not the sharp panic from watching Dante get handcuffed, but something slower, heavier. Grief. Finally catching up to her, the way it catches up to everybody eventually, whether they're ready for it or not. "I'm so sorry, Daddy,"
she said. "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I'm sorry I let him anywhere near this family. I'm sorry Mama had to face him alone because I was too scared to face my own doubts about him." I stood up and crossed the small distance between us, and I pulled my daughter up out of that chair and held onto her the way I had not held onto her since she was small enough to fit against my chest with room to spare. She cried hard into my shoulder, her whole body shaking with it, and I just stood there and let her, the same way Josephine used to let her cry when she was young, and the world had disappointed her in some way too big for words. "None of this is your fault to carry alone," I told her. My hand moving slow over her back the way it used to when she was a little girl scared of thunderstorms. "You made a mistake, trusting the wrong man. That's a mistake half the people in this world make at least once before they learn better. Your mother did not die because of anything you did. She died because a predator came into our lives, wearing a good suit and a kind voice, and none of us saw him clear enough, soon enough." We stood like that a long while longer than either of us probably needed to, but neither one of us in a hurry to be the first to let go. Cornell came back inside, eventually giving us both a nod, telling us the officers had everything they needed for now, and that there would be more questions in the coming days, statements to give. Paperwork neither of us was going to enjoy filling out. He said Detective Alvarez in Cleveland was already reopening the Jenkins case that same night, first thing, once she heard what had turned up on that recording. Renee finally stepped back from me, wiping her face dry with both hands, looking around the shop like she was seeing it fresh for the first time in years. "Daddy, what happens now?" she asked. "To the house, to the shop, to us." I looked around the place myself, 38 years of my life sitting in every wrench and every stain on that concrete floor. And I thought about Josephine circling that recipe box every evening, and about the pendant that had finally told us the truth she died trying to protect. "I've got an idea," I told Renee something, starting to take shape in my chest that felt lighter than anything I'd carried in weeks. "But I'm going to need your help to make it work right." 6 weeks passed before the new sign went up over the shop. 6 weeks of lawyers and paperwork and a phone call from Detective Ruth Alvarez in Cleveland, confirming that the Jenkins case had officially been reclassified. The old ruling of accidental death struck through and replaced with something closer to the truth. Marcus Del Rey Whitfield sat now in the county jail, awaiting trial on charges that stretched across 3 states. And Cornell told me the Cleveland prosecutors were already building a case strong enough that even the best lawyer money could buy was not going to walk him free from all of it. Renee came by the shop most days during those 6 weeks, same as she had when she was a teenager, helping me sweep up after closing for a little extra allowance money. We did not talk much about Dante during that stretch of time, mostly because there was not much left worth saying about a man who had turned out to be 3 or 4 different men stitched together with lies. Instead, we talked about her mother, about the shop, about what a life built honest actually looked like once you stripped away everything false sitting on top of it. The idea had come to me slow, piece by piece, in the quiet hours after everyone else had gone home those first nights back at the shop alone. I kept thinking about young men who came through my bay doors over the years looking for work, veterans mostly, boys back from overseas with steady hands and nowhere steady to put them. And about how Josephine used to say the whole neighborhood needed more places willing to teach a skill instead of just selling a service. We hired a contractor to redo the back half of the shop, first knocking out a wall to open up space for a second set of lifts, room enough for 4 students to work alongside me instead of just 1 apprentice at a time. Renee handled the paperwork for the nonprofit status herself, pulling favors from lawyer friends she still had from her old firm, working late some nights the same way she used to work late chasing partnership before any of this happened to our family. Cornell helped too, more than I ever expected a retired police chief to help setting up a trade school, though he said it gave him something worthwhile to do with his mornings, now that chasing down forged signatures had turned into an unexpected side career for him. He knew veterans groups all across the city, men he'd worked with over the years through the department's outreach programs, and within a month we had a list of 11 names,
young men, and a few young women too,
all wanting a chance to learn something with their hands that nobody could take from them once they'd learned it proper.
The sign went up on a Saturday morning in early spring, the kind of morning where the air still carried winter's bite, but the light coming through had started warming up around the edges, the way it does once a season is finally ready to turn. I stood out front with Renee beside me while the two workers from the sign company climbed down their ladder and stepped back to let us see it finished. The Josephine Ashworth Trade Program, it read, painted in the same deep blue as the dress Josephine had worn to church most Sundays for as long as I could remember. Gold lettering catching the morning sun bright enough that a man walking past on the sidewalk stopped a moment just to read it twice.
Free automotive and mechanical training for veterans and neighborhood youth, the smaller line beneath it read, alongside a phone number Renee had set up just for the program, separate from the shop's regular business line.
11 young people showed up that first Saturday for orientation, filing into the newly opened bay with the kind of careful, hopeful quiet that reminded me of my own first day walking into a garage as a 19-year-old fresh out of the service myself, unsure whether anybody was going to bother teaching a black boy from the East Side anything worth knowing, back in a world that had not always been kind about doing that.
Renee stood at the front of the room that morning and introduced herself as the program director, her voice steady in a way it had not been steady in months, and I watched something settle into place in her that had been missing since long before her mother ever died, something that looked a whole lot like purpose finding its way back home. I did not say much that first day. I mostly stood near the back, watching young hands reach for tools the way my own hands had reached for tools 50 years earlier, listening to Renee explain safety protocols and shop etiquette with a confidence that made her sound for just a moment exactly like the woman who had raised her. Later that evening, after the last student had gone home and Renee had locked up the new classroom space, I walked back outside alone and stood on the sidewalk looking up at that sign one more time before heading home myself. Josephine had never once asked to have her name on anything in all our years together. She did her good quiet in kitchens and classrooms and church basements, never once needing a plaque or a program named for her to know the value of what she'd given the people around her. But I figured a woman who died trying to protect her family deserved to have her name mean something bigger than the worst thing that had ever happened to her. I stood there a long while in the cooling evening air, the gold letters catching the last of the daylight. And for the first time since the day we lowered her into the ground, I found myself smiling instead of grieving when I thought of her name. Spring turned into summer faster than I expected it to that year, the way seasons have a habit of doing once a person's attention finally lifts up off grief long enough to notice the calendar moving again. By June, the program had grown to 19 students, and Renee had brought on a second instructor, a young woman named Charlene, who had spent 6 years in the Army fixing armored vehicles overseas and knew more about hydraulics than I'd learned in my first 15 years in the trade. I still came in most mornings, same as always, though my role in the shop had shifted some without me quite noticing when it happened. I spent less time under the hood myself these days, and more time standing at a student's shoulder, watching a 19-year-old boy named Tyrell work through his first transmission rebuild, correcting his grip on a torque wrench the same patient way somebody had once corrected mine, back when I was young enough to think engines were the hardest thing this world was going to ask me to understand. Cornell dropped by most Fridays, bringing coffee for whoever wanted it, sitting on his usual stool near the bench, and trading stories with the students about the neighborhood, the way it used to be, back before half the storefronts on this stretch of road had gone dark. He told me once, quiet, just between the two of us, that helping build this place had done something for him he had not expected retirement to ever offer. A reason to get up in the morning that felt like it mattered as much as carrying a badge once had. Renee moved out of the house that spring into a small apartment closer to downtown, closer to the program's growing list of partner organizations she was courting for grant money and donated equipment. She still came by Sunday evenings for dinner, same as her mother and I used to host every week for anybody in the family who wanted a plate and some company. She cooked those pork chops a little better now than she had that first difficult Friday after the funeral, and I never once told her I noticed the improvement, letting her feel she'd figured it out on her own.
I kept Josephine's sewing box on the dresser in our bedroom, empty now of its secrets, but still holding her scissors and her thread, still smelling faintly of the lavender sachet she used to tuck inside it every few months. Some evenings I sat on the edge of the bed and held it in my lap a while, not looking for anything anymore, just holding something her hands had held every day for 40 years. The trial for Marcus Del Rey Whitfield, the name the courts used now instead of Dante Cole, was scheduled for early autumn, and Cornell told me the evidence stacking up against him across 3 states had grown thick enough that his lawyer had already started making noises about a plea deal instead of risking a jury hearing everything laid out plain. I did not know yet whether I would need to testify myself, whether I would have to sit in a courtroom and say her name out loud for strangers. But I found I was not afraid of that day the way I might have been afraid of it back in December, standing helpless at her graveside. Grief had not left me, not fully. Not the way people sometimes talk about moving past a loss, like it's a mile marker you drive by and never see again in your mirror. It sat with me, still most mornings, in the quiet half-second before I remembered she was gone, in the particular ache of reaching for a second coffee mug out of habit before catching myself. But it had changed shape somewhere along the way, softened at its hardest edges, the way a piece of metal softens under steady heat until it finally bends into something useful instead of just something sharp. I thought about that a lot, working in that shop those long summer afternoons. How a man spends his whole life learning to find the cracks in things before they break wide open and cost somebody everything. How I had built a career out of catching structural failure before it happened, to buildings and to engines, and somehow still missed the failure happening right inside my own family, right under my own roof, until it had already cost me the one person I could never replace. But I had caught it before it cost me everything, before it cost me Renee, too. And now standing in a shop full of young hands learning an honest trade, a shop carrying my late wife's name in gold letters out front where anybody walking by could read it, I understood something Josephine had probably always understood a little better than I did. Fixing what's broken is not really about the machine at all. It never was. It's about refusing to let the people you love get thrown away just because somebody decided they were too old, too tired, or too much trouble to bother saving. It's about looking at something the world has already written off: a car, a shop, a grieving old man, a daughter, who made one terrible mistake, trusting the wrong person, and deciding it still has good years left in it, if somebody's just willing to put in the work. Josephine spent her whole life doing that quiet one recipe, one student, one act of care at a time. I figured the least I could do with whatever years I had left in me was carry that work forward, loud enough that her name would keep doing it long after I was gone too. People ask me sometimes now when they hear this story secondhand through the neighborhood or through one of the students who tells it better than I ever could myself, whether I regret any part of what happened that year. Whether I wish I had trusted my daughter sooner, or trusted my own eyes sooner, or simply grieved my wife in peace instead of turning myself into a spy inside my own home before I'd even had the chance to properly mourn her. I tell them the truth. I regret that Josephine faced that man alone in our bedroom instead of calling out for help, instead of trusting that her husband could have stood beside her in that fight, instead of learning about it only after she was already gone. I regret every day I spent believing my own son-in-law, watching him sit at my table, eating food my daughter cooked, never once seeing past the good suit and the easy smile to the man practicing my signature in some quiet room I never once thought to check. But I do not regret choosing the truth over comfort, even when the truth cost me weeks of feeling like a stranger in my own life, playing a part I never wanted to play. Because the alternative, the easy road, the road where an old man just signs what's put in front of him and trusts that family means what family used to mean, that road ends the same way it ended for Willa Mae Jenkins.
quiet, alone, at the bottom of somebody's stairs, with nobody left to ask the hard questions once the casket's already closed. Josephine used to tell me that love without vigilance is just a nice word for foolishness. She said it about raising Renee, about running the shop, about everything that ever mattered enough to protect. I did not fully understand what she meant until I found her handwriting hidden inside that sewing box, warning me from beyond her own grave about a danger she'd seen coming long before I ever did. What I learned that year more than anything else is that the people who love us hardest are sometimes the ones working quietest to keep us safe, and that our job in return is to pay close enough attention to notice when something in the people around us stops adding up. Not suspicion for its own sake, not living scared, just paying attention, the way you'd pay attention to a strange sound coming from an engine you know well enough to trust, when something's finally gone wrong inside it. Renee and I are closer now than we were even before any of this happened. Closer maybe than we've ever been, since she was small enough to ride on my shoulders through the church parking lot on Sunday mornings. We do not talk about Dante much anymore, though we talk about her mother plenty. About the woman whose quiet courage saved both our lives, even after her own had already ended. Some wounds do not close so much as they teach you how to carry them different, lighter. Further from the center of your chest where they used to sit heaviest. The shop still smells like motor oil and coffee most mornings, same as it always has. But now it smells like something else, too. Like second chances. Like young hands learning a trade that will feed their families the honest way for years to come. Josephine's name sits over that door in gold letters. And every single day, some stranger walking past stops long enough to read it and ask somebody what it means. And every single day, somebody gets to tell them the answer. If you're listening to this and you've got an elder in your life, a mother, a father, a grandparent, living alone with a little money saved up and a big, trusting heart, do me a favor and check in on them this week. Ask them who's been coming around lately. Ask them if anybody's been a little too interested in their paperwork, their property, their plans for the future. It might feel like nothing. It might turn out to be nothing at all, but it might also be the one conversation that saves somebody you love from becoming the next Willa Mae Jenkins, the next Josephine Ashworth. Before it's too late to do anything but grieve. Take care of your elders. Listen when they say something feels wrong, even when they can't quite explain why. And never underestimate how much strength is still sitting inside a person the world has already decided is too old to fight back. My name is Leon Ashworth. I'm 70 years old, and some of the best work of my whole life didn't happen under the hood of a car. It happened in the 6 months after I buried my wife, when I finally learned what she'd been trying to teach me all along. That love, real love, sometimes looks less like comfort and more like courage. If this story moved something in you, let me know down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to protect somebody you love from a danger they couldn't see coming themselves, tell me about it below. I'd like to hear it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories like this one. Stay close to the people who love you, quiet, and never stop paying attention.